Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf kufri chet. This is, I would like to tell you from the beginning of class, this is quite a complicated daf. I've made a study guide to help guide you through it. So highly recommended to use the study guide, and at least if not while you're learning, maybe to review after. With that, we'll get started. We saw the Mishna, which talked about different parts of the animal that would actually join together for impurity for purposes of food. I mean, if a food, in order for it to become impure or to pass on impurity, we said maybe not necessarily become impure, but it needs a certain requisite amount for sure to pass on impurity. For that, you can have the requisite amount, which is a kibetza, include also what's called a shomer, like for example, the hide, right, the skin, or the hooves. We said of that list in the Mishnah were shomer. But this doesn't work for nevela, for the carcass, for impurity of a carcass, which is an avatuma, which is a much more strict impurity because it's an avatuma, whereas food is always going to be a rishon or a sheni, and it's always going to be, the impurity was passed onto it from something else. So in general, the nevela is more strict. Well, there's no din of shomrim by nevela. And then in the Gemara, we brought a braita to show this, okay, that brought the sources for this. Rabbi Shmuel said, Al kol zera zerua asher yizareha, okay, that will be planted. We said, oh, from there we learn it's like things are planted. That's the context of the psukim here. I brought all the psukim, Vayikra chapter 11, verses 37 to 38. Okay, 37 has Al kol zera zerua asher yizareha. And from there we learn, and then if you put water on it and a sheretz falls on it, it will become impure. From there we learn laws of shomrim for food, lihitzdaref. Now, the word lihitzdaref does not appear in this braita, to join together. So we're going to get to that soon. How do we know it's lihitzdaref? Maybe it just means to get impure. The shomer will become impure, meaning, okay, now there's two issues here. One is, does it combine together? Okay, once we get really into that, you're going to realize that this is a big difference. There's to pass on impurity, there's for it to become impure, there's to pass on impurity, and then there's will it join together to have that requisite amount. Those are different issues. Okay, so now it doesn't say in this braita, Rabbi Yishmael just says, it doesn't say the word there for lihitzdaref, but we assume it means that it will join together. The shomer will join together just like the shell of the seed will join together for impurity of food. How do we know lo shomrim l'tumah chamura? Because it says, this is the end of yesterday's daf, b'nivlata v'lo b'or she'en alav kazayah basar. Because it says, ki amut min ha'behema, if an animal dies, asher hi lachem l'ochlav, it's for you to eat. Hanogea b'nivlata, if you touch its nivela, yitmar erev, you will become impure. But just as nivela, not if you touch the shomer, just the meat, not the hide, for example. But now the braita says something that seems a little contradictory. You might think if you touch the shomer, the hide, when the meat is on the other side of it, meaning attached to it, and it has a kazayit, maybe you won't become tamei, okay? Because we just said, it sounds like you're not going to become tamei with the shomer. There's no law of shomer. Tamalomar yitma. Therefore, it says yitma. Because the pasuk says, hanugeh b'nivlata yitma. B'nivlata is a limiting word. Yitma is a inclusive word. So it's going to include a shomer. Now this is very confusing. It says on the one hand, it's not going to include a shomer. On the other hand, it is going to include a shomer. So the Gemara asks, my kamar, what is going on here? Amar Rava, Amar Lakti. So Rava said, or maybe someone else said, Chisur mechasr v'hachi katanya. Now we're going to make some order here. And that's what this chart is for, the first chart on the page. B'nivlata v'lo b'or she'en alav kazayah basar v'or mashlimo l'kazayit. B'nivlata means not the hide that doesn't have a kazayit, and only together with the hide and the meat will you get to a kazayit. Meaning, okay, very clearly now, what it means is b'nivlata comes to say there's no law of shomrim for the issue of lihitzdaref, for it to join together, okay? The shomer does not join the meat to get to this requisite amount to pass on impurity. So if I come across a piece of meat that doesn't have a kazayit, but with its hide, it has a kazayit, and I touch that whole thing, altogether it has a kazayit, an olive bulk, which is the amount of nevela you need to make you impure, I will not become impure because the shomer doesn't join together. Whereas if it's food and we want to know, does this have a kibetza to pass on impurity to something, we will have the shomer, the peel of the fruit, be also counted. That's the big difference here. Now, continues the braita, what about yitma then? Yitma is saying there is a law of shomer for nevela. ככל שאני מוציא אף אור שיש עליו כזית בשר, הנוגע כנגע בשר מאחוריו, יכול לא יהא טמא, ואפילו מעשה יד נמי לא עביד, Talmud lomar yitma. The yitma drasha is coming to tell me something else, which is not for lihitztareh, for joining seruf. It's for saying, if I have an olive bulk of meat, but I didn't touch the meat, I only touched the hide, and the hide is attached to the kazayit of meat, I become impure also, meaning impurity passes through the shomer. So impurity can be passed via the shomer, even though I never touched the meat, I just touched the hide. As long as there's a kazayit of meat, yes, I will be impure. But if I don't have a kazayit of meat, the hide can't connect with the kazayit to make that an amount that will pass on impurity. That's basically what we're saying from the two. Okay, I just want to explain the words I didn't really explain, which is, right, so let's just review those few words again. Yachol shani motzi, I might have thought it might be excluded, or sheyesh alav kazayit basal, if it has a kazayit of meat, and I touch the meat on the other side, I touch the hide on the other side of the meat, you might have thought, lo yehei tameh, I wouldn't be impure. Now, here are the words I didn't explain. Va'afilu maseh yad nami lo avid, and maybe it won't even be like a yad. Remember what a yad is? We talked about yesterday. It's a handle. Let's say I have a bone and there's meat at the other end of the bone. If I touch the meat, and I touch the bone, not the meat, since the bone is holding the meat, right? It becomes a handle. If I touch the bone, I become impure. Again, assuming there's a kazayit of meat there. So you might have thought maybe it's not like that. Talmud lomar yitma. Yitma comes to say it is. Okay, so there we have the law. We have three laws here. There is a law of shomrim for combining, right? The shomer combines with the food for tumat ochlin, not for tumat nevela. But a shomer, I can't become impure by touching the shomer, also in nevela, obviously also in food, although we're going to get to this, how we know in food as well. Tananata. So now we have a Mishna in Uktzin. It's the first I mentioned Masechet Uktzin yesterday. It's the first Mishna Masechet Uktzin, and it's talking about specifically food. Okay, so we mentioned here nevela and food, but now we're talking about the impurity of food. Kol shuhu yad velo shomer, tamei umitamei ve'eno mitztaref. If you have a yad, but not a shomer, we have something that functions like a bone. It's attached to the meat, but it's not protecting the meat. It's not a shomer. It's tamei and mitamei, ve'eno mitztaref. A yad, okay, just like we said, nevela doesn't have a law of tseruf, neither does a yad. So a yad can be what we're going to call it now. We're going to have this chart here. Okay, I want you to, or you can almost, I would say, almost memorize this chart. We're going to have this chart 8 times. Okay, we're going to go through this chart 8 different times because we're going to keep questioning and correcting and things like that. We're going to have a whole set of difficulties. If it's a yad and not a shomer, it's tamei mitamei be'eno mitztaref. Okay, meaning we're going to later call this lachnis. It can become impure. It can bring in impurity to the item, meaning I can bring in the item I can bring in impurity through the handle. So if I have a handle of food, okay, then if I'm impure, I touch the handle, let's say the stem of an apple. So I'm holding the stem. Again, it would have to be a stem that you really hold the apple by its stem. Then I will make the apple impure. And lahotzi, if the apple is impure and it touches another apple, but only through its stem, meaning its stem touches some other kind of food, it will pass on impurity. And not litzaref though, but if you're not sure if there's enough of the item, right? You don't know, doesn't have enough to pass on impurity, then it will not pass on impurity. Okay? Which means you don't count the yad to join the amount to get to the requisite amount of kibetza that we need. That's the first part of the Mishnah. Now we move to the shomer. Shomer, afa pishe'enu yad, even though it's not a yad, meaning you can have something that's a shomer but doesn't function as a yad. Tamei umitamei. Okay, and there's a lot of things in this first tavla I filled in after. Okay, so you just need the checks and the X's right now. Tamei umitamei umitztaref. This is lahachnisu lotzi. It both brings in impurity and it can become impure through the shomer. It could pass on impurity through the shomer, meaning again, if someone touches only the shomer of it, the peel of the apple, okay, or I would say maybe the peel of an orange or something, and it's not really inherently part of the fruit, but, okay, and it's mitzdaref, okay? If it's lo yav, lo shomer, lo tameh, lo mitameh. Now, if it's, let's say, a little, like maybe in the apple, if it's a little thing that doesn't really protect it and it doesn't you don't use it as a handle because it's too teeny, then, right, the little stem there, lo tameh v'lo mitameh, okay? It doesn't have the laws of any of this. Now we want to know yadot hechaktivis. So now we want to know the source for this. And now we're going to go back to our psukim, dichtiv, v'chiyu tamayim al zera v'nafal minivlatam alav, tameh hu lachem. If water gets upon it, this is pasuk lamed ched, v'chiyu tamayim al zera, v'nafal minivlatam alav, tameh hu lachem. Now what's this pasuk talking about? It's talking about passing on impurity to the food. So that would be what I called before lahachnis. Now the Gemara didn't use this word term, but they're going to say it right now. Lachem lechol shebitzar. They're going to say it soon. Lachem lechol shebitzarchechem. Okay, this word lachem, for you, is coming to teach you for anything that you would need. Okay, meaning, or as I would say better, anything that serves it, like the yad. L'rabot et hayadot. So this comes to include the yad. Uchtiv. Okay, now that was in terms of food. Now we're going to bring a pasuk about nevela, about a dead carcass, even though right now this isn't talking about carcasses. So hold off, but you'll see. Uchtiv v'chiyamu min habehema asher hi lachem. Okay, if you look back at these pasukim, also by nevela, it says asher hi lachem. That same lachem word appears there, which is really unnecessary. Could just say asher hi la'ochla, not lachem la'ochla for you to eat it. It's for eating. Lachem l'chol shebetzarchechem l'rabot et hayado. So now, why is this brought here? Because in this case, we're not talking about an item becoming impure. We're talking about an item passing on impurity, because an avela becomes impure since the animal dies. Now we're talking about passing on the impurity to something else. And again, we see the same idea, that it's lechem lechot tzarchechem. So that got us the first two parts of this chart. We have lachnis is from lechem and hechsher, which is about food. Lahutzi is lechem and nevela. Now we have shomer lahachnis ulahutzi lo tzarech kra. And what about a shomer? Well, for both lachnis and lotzi, we don't even need a pasuk. Why? Because we're going to make a simple kavachomer. Kavachomer miyad ate. We can easily make a kavachomer from yad to shomer. Why? Uma yad she'ena migina, a handle, doesn't even protect the item. And yet, machnes and motzia, and yet it's important enough to pass on, to become impure, be able to have the item become impure through the yad, and pass on impurity through the yad, without anything ever touching the food. So shomer, which protects it, lo koshakin, all the more so. So once we have a law by yad, we're always going to be able to make a kavachomer to the shomer. Shomer, the katav rachman olam ali. Now we finally get to where we're coming from, which is if we started our daf, we said, how do you know there's shomer for ochel lihitztaref? We had a shared yizarea. That was the first thing from yesterday's daf. The first thing the Gemara said. To shomrim l'tum'ah kala, and then where do we get it from? Al kol zera zerua, a shared yizarea. Kederach she'adam motzi l'zriach, he publicly pata, right? The grain in its shell. From there you learn, right? Law of shomer for food. Now we said for tseruf, but how do you know it's litzaref? Maybe it's to become impure. So what do they say, right? Lahachnis or lahotzi. So they say, well, lahachnis or lahotzi, we just learned from kavachomer miyad, from yad. So from the handle. So Asher Yizarah must be to teach you shomer litzaref. And that's only by a shomer, not by yad, and we don't make a kavachomer in the other direction. So that's how we get to this difference that the Mishna Uktzin said about, which is if it's a yad and not a shomer, it's tameh and mitameh, but not mitzaref. And the shomer is mitzaref, and that's because of this extra trasha Asher Yizareh, which could have theoretically taught us lachnis lotzi, but we don't need a pasuk for that, so we're going to use that pasuk for something else. Okay, that's the reasonably simple part. Now comes the complication, because the Gemara, we're going to have 7 different versions of this, okay? We're now going to say who said this is the way the chart should look, both in terms of the checks and X's, and in terms of the drashot. Okay, we're going to start questioning. Maybe there's only a yad for food, lachnis, to make it become impure. But maybe you can't use a yad to pass on impurity, meaning, again, if the fruit was tameh, impure, and the stem, that's the yad, okay, the handle of it touched something else, but not the fruit itself. It would have to touch food or drink, because food can only pass on impurity to other food. It would pass on impurity, even though the impure food never touched it. Maybe it's only that, but not lahotzi. Maybe it wouldn't. And then shomer. Now, why would we say that? Because the word lachem that we darshaned about lahotzi was about nevela, and maybe it's only for nevela, which is a stricter kind of impurity, and not for food. And then we'd say the following: what was the whole theory? We had some drasha she'er which tries something about a shomer for a law of a shomer. And by process of elimination, we said, well, it can't be talking about lachnis or lotzi because that's a kavachomer from yad. But if yad doesn't have a law of lahotzi, there is no yad lahotzi in food, then then there's no kavachomer for shomer. And then you would say yad lahotzi v'shomer l'tzaref lo. There is no yad lahotzi, which means that Asher Yizareh is going to come to teach you that a shomer will be lahotzi. Okay, so we're going to have it like this. Yad lachnis is from the word lachem, from food, right? From the food pasuk. From there we have a kol v'chomer to shomer, as we said before. If the yad is not meginan, yet it's machnes and motziah shomer lo koshkin, right? If the yad doesn't protect and the shomer does, obviously the shomer will. But lahotzi, we have no pasuk for the yad, so we have no law there. It doesn't lahotzi. So you can't pass on impurity through a yad. But by a shomer you can. That's from the pasuk Asher Yizareh, which means that neither of them has a law of tzeruf because there's no pasuk open for tzeruf. To which the Gemara answers, "La'achnisu lotzi lo matzit amaret." There's no logic at all to say the yad would be la'achnis and not lahotzi tum'ah, because this is a phrase, I will call it yesh me'ayin. Something comes from out of nowhere is much harder than something that already exists. So hashte iyule ma'ayle afuke mebaya. If we say lahachnis, because that's the pasuk says, right, it's talking about a sheretz falling on top of the food, and we're going to say that works with the yad. Now that comes from nowhere. There's no impurity on this food, and all of a sudden the impurity is going to come through the yad. If it can come in that way, of course it's going to be able to be passed on. Once the food is already impure, it's much easier to say, oh, we can use the yad, the handle, to pass on impurity. So therefore, we're going to go to chart number 3 and say, okay, yad, now we have to switch the chart. The first switch we're going to do here is yad lehachnis, okay? Yad lehotzi. Okay, so now we're gonna say like this, okay? Let's just say it like the answer the Gemara gave us, if there's lachnis, then there's definitely lahotzi. So in order to respond to this and say, wait a minute, this still doesn't work, we're going to go to chart number 3. Sorry, chart number 3 doesn't explain this. Chart number 3 would just be, once you have lachnis, obviously you have lahotzi. Okay, I could have made another chart like that, but I didn't. Now we're going to move on. Ein yad lahotzi v'lo lachnis. Wait, we can have another difficulty. We can still say that there's no law, that this yad only has one law. Okay, now we're going to flip it. Instead of starting like we did before, which what we thought was obvious, that's where we're starting, that the drasha lachem by hechsher is lachnis tumah, because the whole lachem is tumah becoming upon it. That's the pasuk. It's talking about tumah coming upon it. Maybe that's really teaching yad about lahotzi in the less obvious case. So yad lahotzi is learned from lachem hechsher. That means in the pasuk of hechsher, which is about food, the yad can pass on impurity. That's what we're learning from that drasha. Then we have no pasuk for lahachnis tum'ah, because that we could say, okay, well, we have another pasuk of lachem, but that's for nevela, and maybe that's only for nevela and not for food. So we have only one law of yad. That law we're going to pass on to shomer, and then shomer lahotzi, to pass on impurity. We can say kavachomer from yad. If yad, then all the more so the shomer. And then, right, so let's just read it. Yad lahotzi v'lo lachnis, shomer lahotzi ulahachnis. Now, how do we get to shomer lachnis? But we don't learn it from a kavachomer from yad. We learn it from Asher Yizareh. That pasuk we have about a shomer. That pasuk is about a shomer for food, but we don't know, right, what it's for. We're going to say, oh, it must be lachnis tuma, and then we're left with yad lahachnis. There's no pasuk. And obviously litzaref, and shomer litzaref lo, and then we don't have a pasuk for shomer litzaref. And that's another question on this method of darshaning that we're going to get it from lachem. Hechsher, it's not going to really work, because we still can't say that Asher Yizareh is coming for sure for litzaref. So they say, okay, yad yetera k'tiv. Let's try something else. Okay, you might have noticed this at the top psukim, you might not, but there's 3 lachems in the psukim. The first pasuk we didn't read yet is about vessels becoming impure, and that's in pasuk Lamed Hey 35, in the same chapter 11 in Vayikra. If the sheretz, a dead sheretz, falls upon it, will become impure. Tanur v'kirayim yutatz, if it's an earthenware vessel of an oven or burners, they will be broken. Tmeim hem, they're impure. Utmeim yu lachem, obviously that's unnecessary, and they will be impure to you. No reason for that, it's obvious. So lachem is again unnecessary, so they're going to say, we have an extra pasuk, because it says tanur v'kirayim yutatz, lachem lechol shebetzarchechem lerabot hayadot. Okay, so from there we have an extra pasuk, and from that extra pasuk we're going to say, now we think right now that we're going like this. Okay, chart number 4. Lahotzi is from, because from now on we're going to go in that order, not lachnis and then lahotzi, but lahotzi first, because that's easier to say. So lachem by food is lahotzi. Lachnis, lachem from tanur and the vessels. Litzaref, we don't have a pasuk because there is no din of yad for tzeruf, for joining the amounts together. Shomer, lahotzi lahachnis, kavachomer from yad, and asher yizarez, then open to teach you shomer litzaref, and that would work. But the Gemara says, wait a minute, which of these psukim is unnecessary? And now they're going to put together all 3 lachem drashot. We have lachem for food, lachem for vessels, and lachem for nevela. So now let's see. And now we're going to have a very long chart. It starts at the bottom of the first page and goes to the second page. Maybe the Torah should have just said foods, ra'im are the seeds, but it really means food. And you could have learned, we're going to go through all the possibilities of what you could have learned from the other, which one you could have learned, which one you could, and then we're going to basically try to reject every single one. So we're going to say we could have learned from food to the tanur and the nevela, okay, to the vessels and the dead carcass, but we couldn't have, because malis ra'im, and then say, oh, well, ochel, there's din of yad, then all the more so by all the others. But no, shekem tumatam meruva. But we already learned this in a Mishna, that it's easier to get things impure for food because it's a lighter kind of impurity, and because of that, just a lot more things become impure. First of all, food can be even a sheni, and it just, right, and it's easier to pass on impurity. Okay, and therefore maybe it passes on impurity through a yad, but the others don't. Let's try tanur now. Lichta rachmana b'tanur. Try it by the oven, by the vessels. V'leite hanach meinei. And then we can learn from there for food and nevela. But again, it's going to have a stringency. Malet tanur shekem etamei me'aviro. This is a unique halacha by an earthenware vessel, that if a sheretz falls into the airspace of the vessel without actually touching any part of the vessel, impurity will be passed on. And that's right, doesn't work for food and nevela. So again, it has a stringency that doesn't exist by the others. Lift brachmana b'nevela v'leite hanach minei. We say it by nevela and then learn all the rest from there. But mala nevela shekem etama. Okay, this is going to have 3 chumrot. Shekem etama adam. Only that one is an avatuma, passed on impurity to people and to humans and drinks. Okay, I'm sorry, humans and vessels. Whereas tanur and ochel can only be rishons at best and can pass on impurity only to food and drink. Umatama b'masa. And it passes on impurity by carrying. If you carry a carcass without touching it, but it's on a tray, okay, you carry a piece of a carcass, you become impure, but not true for the vessels or the food. And tumayot sami gufa, and it itself is impure. The tanur and the food only become impure because something tamei touched them, but the nevela becomes impure just by the animal dying. So that has 3 stringencies. So for sure you can't learn from there. Okay, so chada mechada lo atya. Clearly you can't learn one from the other. Tete chada mitarte. Maybe you could learn from 2 to the 3rd one. Like, for example, hey tite. Well, which one? Lo lichta rachmana b'zra'im. Let's try. Don't learn. The pasuk didn't need to say food, and that would be unnecessary. V'tete mihanach, and you could learn it from the oven and the carcass. But malahanach shekem etamim shelo behechsher. Those become impure even without liquid getting upon them. Whereas tamar b'zra'im, but the seeds, the food, sheim etamim ela behechsher, only when liquid gets upon it first is it going to become impure. But this one's not a good chumrah, as you can see. I crossed it out because the Gemara is going to say, Amar Rav Huna, Bered Rav Yoshua, Perot shelo uchsharu ketanur shelo nigmara melachto dami. Also by vessels, we have the same idea. Now, it doesn't happen through liquids. It happens through finishing to build the oven. Until it's finished, it's not impure. What do you think liquids coming upon something is? It's to finish them, right? You won't eat a potato from the ground with all its dirt until you wash it. So washing is like Gemar Melacha by vessels, which means they are actually the same, but they don't have a chumrah that's not in the food. Okay, Ella, well, we have a different knockout. Ella parachachi, malahanach shekem etamim shelo b'nigi'ah. Both a nevela can become impure without nevela, right? It can pass on impurity without touching through masa, and the vessel can pass on impurity by it getting the sheretz coming into its airspace. So both of them do it without touching, whereas food only by touching, and therefore again they have astringency not by food. That's why you need the pasuk in food. It's not unnecessary. Okay, maybe learn from nevela and food to the oven. Well, malahanach shekain ochel. Okay, now we have what I called here a pircha kolshehu. This is what we had the other day about what kind of pircha this is. This isn't a chumrah, but it is a characteristic that's true for food and nevela, which is they're both food. And a vessel is a vessel, not food. So you could say maybe we can't learn from those two to an oven. So, okay, let's try this one. Don't write it by nevela and learn it from food and an oven, and then nevela will be unnecessary, to which the Gemara says, in achinami, you're right. Okay, and now they're going to explain. Ya de nevela lamali. So then why do we need this pasuk? Lachem for nevela. It's really unnecessary. You really could have learned that there's no stringency by food and an oven. That isn't true for nevela. So if we have this pasuk of yad of nevela, which is unnecessary, we could say, now there's a big cross out on all this, but right now let's try to explain this before we cross it out and reject it. And this also you can see in the chart number 5. This is a classic method of darshaning. If you don't need it for this, well then, now if you remember when we started, we said lachem is for nevela. We're not going to learn from there to food. Now we're saying we are, because the yad and nevela is totally unnecessary. So we're then going to say, oh, it's not coming for itself. It must be coming for some other yad of food. Okay, and since we have yad of food lahotzi, we'll say, oh, lachem of nevela is coming for yad lahachnis. Okay, even though if you remember before we said it's kind of ironic to do this because lahotzi is actually more relevant for the nevela. It passes on impurity, whereas lachnis would be more relevant for the hechsher, but okay, let's just go with it. Yad nevela lamali meno yad liyad nevela tnei yad liyad am. So yad alma means general yad, which means food. Yad lahachnis, yad lahotzi, shomer letzaref. So we're left with yad lahotzi, yad lachnis. Kav a chomer for both of them to shomer. The Asher Yizareh pasuk is left open to darshan for shomer letzaref. And that would be a nice, perfect chart for what we're looking for, because we're trying to figure out how we know shomer, that pasuk Asher Yizareh is for shomer letzaref. But akate yad nevela itzrich. No, we actually do need the pasuk of yad lenevela. It's not really unnecessary because ikat rachmana benevela, and you want it right. Ilo kat rachmana benevela. If you didn't write it by nevela and you wanted to learn it from food and vessels, havamina dayol avomanadin liyot kanidom. When we have exera shava, what do we say? Or I'm sorry, kal v'chomer. Or here it's really like we're going to learn they're all the same. Well, if you're learning deriving one thing from another thing, it's only lihiyot kanidon. You can only learn what's true for ochel and tanur. Now, there's a big difference between them. Malahanach lo mitamei adam. Now, both a food and vessels can't pass on impurity to a human, and not to vessels either. Af nevela lo mitamei adam. So we might say, well, a yad of a nevela can pass on impurity. It might only be able to pass on impurity to food and drink, just like the food in the oven. That's why you need its own pasuk to say, even for an adam, touching the yad, if a person touches the yad, they will become impure of a nevela. And that's why you need that, in which case it's not unnecessary. Okay, so ela yad de nevela mitzrach tzarich, we need that pasuk. V'shomer de nevela hu de lo tzarich. Now we're going to say, okay, this chart 5 showed before we rejected it. Now we're moving on. So fine, we'll use a different pasuk. The pasuk of shomer by nevela is completely unnecessary. Okay, why? Where do we learn that from? That goes all the way back to the beginning of our daf. Shomer by nevela passes on, right, is not mitzdarif, but does pass on impurity. We learned that from the word yitma, the inclusion word. Now, hu de lo tzarich. Okay, we're now going to say shomer nevela is unnecessary, and that's what we learn. Now we're going to see how we learn it, but that's what we're going to learn to yad by food. Okay, we're going to make a jump. Few jumps from shomer of nevela to yad for food, but we're going to have to see first how we get there. First, we have to show that shomer nevela is unnecessary. Well, what's the pasuk of shomer ben nevela teaching you? Ilitz derufe, is it teaching you that shomer nevela is mitzdaref? No, amrat lo mitzdaref. That already we learned the first thing in today's daf was there's no din of tzeruf by nevela. We saw it in the Mishna and we saw it in the drasha and the Braita. Lamayach de katvei rachmana. So again, ilitz derufe for certainly not. Am I right? Lo mitzdaref. Lehotzi kavachomer miyad ate. Now, if you want to say the shomer of nevela could be motzi, could pass on impurity through its shomer, kavachomer miyadate. We just learned already that you can always make a kavachomer from yad to shomer. If we already have yad of nevela, which we just showed, we have yad of nevela. So, right, the lachem by nevela. So lahotzi would just be a kavachomer from yad. So now we go back to an imeno inyan. Imeno inyan, the shomer de nevela, which, because we don't need that. Tenei inyan, like I said, we're going to make two jumps. Tenei inyan liyad de nevela. So from shomer de nevela, we got to yad de nevela. Now, imeno inyan liyad de nevela, we already have a pasuk, lachem, right? For that, it's orchechem. The imeno inyan liyad de nevela, tenei inyan liyad de alma. So it must be, if it's not coming for yad of nevela, it must be coming for yad de alma, which is food. So now, what do we end up with? Let's just go through chart number 6, version 6. Lahotzi, we learn from lachem behechsher, right? The Gemara is going to say yad lahotzi, yad lahachnis. Okay, lahotzi from lachem by food, yad lahachnis from yitma, the shomer of nevela, which we made two jumps to get to. Not needed for this, not needed for that. Must be yad laochel and shomer litzaref, because right they skip the other part, but obviously the shomer lahotzi and lahachnis is learned by kavachomer from yad. We're left with asher yizareh must be for shomer litzaref, and that would be good. But it's not going to be good because I told you we have more charts. So turning now to Amabet. Ema, imeno inyan l'shomer de nevela, tenei inyan l'shomer de alma. But wait a minute. We don't like this two jumps from shomer to nevela to yab nevela to yab ochel. Why don't we go from shomer to nevela to shomer in food? And maybe it's coming to teach you shomer in food. Okay, so now what would that mean then? Shomer lahachnis v'shomer litzaref. Aval yad lahachnis lo. Now, every time we say shomer, we learn from yad. But maybe there is no law of yad in lahachnis. Okay, so let's explain. We have yad lahotzi, that's from the word lachem, by food. There's no pasuk about lahachnis by food, right? No additional pasuk about food. Right? We're not going to learn it from nevela, because that's needed for its own sake, for nevela and not for food. So we actually, yad is not lahachnis. You can't use the yad to make something become impure. Remember the logic. To pass on impurity once it's already impure is more likely to say, but not to make it become impure, yesh me'ayin, like it was never impure to begin with. We can't use the yad for that. In which case, there's no kavachomer to shomer in lahachnis. There's kavachomer in lahotzi to pass on impurity. We have a kavachomer from yad, from the lachem in food. From there, we get a kavachomer to shomer. The word yitma, which is the inclusionary one, is taking shomer to nevela, to moving it to shomer to food, and saying, oh, from there you get that a shomer can actually pass, impurity can be passed on to a food item through its shomer, through its protector, right? Through its peel, for example. Litzaref then would be learned from asher yizareh. So this actually does teach us the din of tzeruf by shomer, but it has something that we know is not the case, according to the Mishna Uktzin, which is the yad is not machnis. Okay, you can't be machnis to me. You can't bring on impurity or something through the yad. Okay, and that would then go against the Mishnah. But the point is, right, don't prove, what we tried to answer in the previous answer, which is yitma is for shomer ben nevela, but it can't be for that. It must be yad nevela, it can't be for that. Move it to yad la'ochel. No, that doesn't make any sense because you could just simply say it's shomer ba'ochel and then you get to a completely different conclusion. So that's not good either. Well, let's see what the Gemara is going to say. Ela mi'ikara. We go back to the first chart. So this is, I would say, chart number 8, really, but we go back to chart number 1. Okay, but we're going to do a little minor change. So I guess I really should have called chart number 8. But either way, we're going to go back to chart number 1. I really wanted you to know. Back to chart number 1 in terms of the checks and the X's, and you'll see what we're going to do now. So now we're going to go back to what we originally said, which is no. Lachem, by food, is obviously talking about lachnis, to bring in impurity. Now, we should have said this earlier. I don't know why they didn't. Once you have lahachnis, then kavachomer lahotzi, based on that theory of the yesh me'ayin. If through the yad you can bring on impurity into this item that wasn't impure to begin with, of course it can be passing on impurity. Then we have a kavachomer from both of those to shomer. Once we have lachnis and lotzi, you can say, oh, if it's by yad, then of course it's by shomer, which protects it, and the yad doesn't even protect. And then we have asher yizareh, which is our free pasuk, to say, oh, what's it talking about shomer? It must be litzaref. And then we get our perfect chart. Okay, that works really well. Now, you would have been happy had the daf ended here. Okay, but now the Gemara has some questions. First, they have a difficulty, and then we're going to bring Rav Chaviva, who has a different answer entirely. Okay, and I wouldn't say entirely. He's going to actually go back to chart number 6. Okay, so anyway, let's go first with our difficulty. Ela shomer de nevela lamali. What's shomer de nevela? In other words, the shomer of nevela was yitma. Now we have no purpose for it because we already have shomer by nevela, kavachomer from yad. So we have this unnecessary pasuk where we learned from the word yitma to shomer of nevela, right? Notice that doesn't appear on this chart anywhere. It should really appear right here where it says kavachomer from yad. And if you go back to the previous chart, shomer lahotzi should be from this nevela pasuk. Okay, shomer of nevela, where we said yitma comes to include. So what do we need it for? Legufe. So they said, what do you mean? It's needed for its own sake. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Lemai. Elitz derufe, if it's to say shomer of nevela, ledin seiruf, amar lo mitzdaref. We're basically going to say process of elimination. There's no option here. If you're going to say it's to say there's seiruf by shomer of nevela, we already learned in the very beginning there is no seiruf. Remember, that was the whole Mishna, and that's what the Breita said. No, here's the law that there is no seiruf from the word beniflata. Only in nevela, not its shomer. Right? If you want to say it's lachnis or you want to say it's lotzi, you already learned that from a kavachomer from yad. To which they answer, simple answer, which is going to raise a different problem. It's true you could have learned it from a kavachomer from yad, but sometimes the pasuk tells us something that you could have learned from a kavachomer anyway. Okay, which is reasonable. You could have learned it from a kavachomer, but we gave you a pasuk. Okay, wait a minute. Our whole theory of everything, I'll call Zera Zeru Asher Yizareh. What have we been saying all along? Asher Yizareh is coming to teach you Shomer of Litzaref. It's not coming to teach you Lahachnis or Lahotzi by Shomer because we already learned that by Kavachomer. So we hachi Shomer Da'alme Malach Lachnis. Umiltidati B'Kavachomer Tarch V'Katav Lakra. Right? We could have just said Asher Yizareh isn't for Tseiruf. It's for Lachnis or Lahotzi. And even though we have a Kavachomer, they brought a pasuk, right? One lachnis, one lahotzi, right? We have Asher Yizareh and we have Yitma, and one would be lachnis, one would be lotzi. So how do we address that? They said, well, hechadi midrash darshinan. No, since we have something else we can darshan from this, we obviously going to darshan Asher Yizareh comes to teach us something else. When we have nothing to darshan, like with the other shomer lachnis, the yitma, so there we say, okay, it's going to teach something we have by kavachomer. But here we have something else to learn, so we learn something else. Okay, that we resolved not so complicated, not such a complicated man. Now we get to Rav Chaviva. Rav Chaviva Amar, and like I said, we're going to go back to chart 6, and we'll see in a minute. Shani shomel de nevela kevan demase yad ka'avid ayad shadin alei. Now let's go back to chart 6. Chart 6, we said, Yitma, okay, this pasuk about Shomer B'Nevela is actually coming to teach us Yad Lahachnis. How we get there, we had to make 2 jumps. Shomer B'Nevela, from there, it can't be talking about that because we already have it. From Kavachomer, must be Yad B'Nevela, that we also have. Yad B'Ochel, okay, it must be Yad by food. So then we say, we don't like to make 2 jumps. When we rejected it, we said Shomer B'Nevela to Shomer B'Ochel. And then we had chart number 7. And that was the whole problematic chart because it's not true. But we tried to say, look, don't say that because we can knock it out with a non-true chart, right? In other words, with something that's wrong. So you're obviously wrong. So they say, what do you mean? It's not really 2 jumps. Shomer B'Nevela jumps you straight to Yad B'Ochel. Why is that? Because a Shomer in Nevela is just like a Yad in Ochel. Why? Yad and Ochel there's no din of tseiruf. It's not mitzdaref, doesn't join together. And also Shomer B'Nevela doesn't have a din of tseiruf. So Shomer B'Nevela is actually very close to Yad B'Ochel. It's not 2 jumps, it's 1 jump. Even though we're changing Shomer to Yad and we're changing Nevela to Ochel, to food, but still it's actually much more similar. And that's his explanation. Okay, with that, we finished this very complicated daf. We didn't finish the daf, sorry. We finished this very complicated section of the daf. We still have half an hour left, which is a little bit simpler, at least most of it, which was this whole attempt to figure out this Mishna in Uktzin, which basically distinguishes between the laws of Yad and Shomer. Okay, and basically says, Yad lachnis lotzi, but not litzaref, and Shomer lachnis lotzi and litzaref, meaning, right, the Shomer works in all 3, the Yad only works for 2, and what is the source for all these things? So it took a while, but eventually we got to 2 different answers. Okay, that's the summary I'm going to do for today. The rest of the summary you can work on your own to review and understand it. Okay, let's go back now to let's go back now to our Gemara. Matkifla Rav Yehuda bar Yishmael. Now, if we go back to the very beginning drasha, we had a drasha where we said that Al kol zera zeru asher yizareh, right? We said, what is that teaching us? That's teaching us shomrim l'tuma kala. Okay, we know there's shomrim for food because Al kol zera zeru asher yizareh, the way people are motziim lizri'ah, the chita in its grain, and the wheat and the lentils and the barley in their grains are planted. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute, I'm going to show you things that aren't planted that way and yet are still shomrim. So comes Rav Yehuda bar Yishmael, and he says, Haditnan pitma shel rimon. There's a bit of a debate. There's going to be the pitma and the nates, which one these are. We'll go with the interpretation that pitma is the crown of the pomegranate, which is a shomer, protects the fruit inside. Mitzdarefet, it does join, but hanetz shelo eno mitzdaref. But again, this debate, but the stem at the bottom, okay, or the top, depending on how you look at it, okay, right, they hang upside down. So the crown is at the bottom, the stem is at the top, okay? The stem, or the little green leaf there, is not mitzdaref. Now, we're not really caring about the stem, we're caring about the pitma. How could it be? Amai, karikan, al kol zera zeru avaleka. We need al kol zera zeru, the way you plant it. You don't plant it with the crown in the ground, and that's not how you plant a rimon tree. There too, and furthermore, haditnan ha'or v'arota v'akifa mitzdaref l'tamei tumat ochlin, our Mishna talked about the or, talked about other shomrim, right, like the tzlafim, the tzlafayim, the hooves, is mitzdaref. Now, we certainly don't plant them. We don't plant them at all. So, Mina, where do we get them from? To which the answer, very simply, elatzlata krai k'tive. It's actually learned from 3 words in that pasuk, which are all the same kind of word. Same root, al kol zera zeru asher yizareh. Notice 3 times it says zera, the root zera. Chad l'shomer dizraim, chad l'shomer dilanot, idach l'shomer basar, ubitzim v'dagim. So 1 is for seeds, 1 is for trees, and the 3rd is for meat, eggs, and fish. Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi Amar Rav. Now we're going to see 2 debates between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Rav says, Yesh yad l'tuma ve'ein yad l'hechsher. There's a yad for passing on impurity, like we said, but there's no yad for a liquid coming upon it. So let's say you have something with a yad on it, and liquid came upon the yad, but not the fruit. That doesn't say that we've made this fruit susceptible to impurity, which makes a lot of sense. It's logical, right? If we talked about it being gemar malacha, about washing the fruit, it's not gemar malacha. It's not like a finished product. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Yesh Yad L'Tuma Ula Hechsher. He says there is. So, what's the root of the machloket? We're going to have 2 ways of looking at it. Or 2 explanations. Some people say it's a logical argument between them. Some people say it's a difference of how they explain the psukim. Now, for this, you have to look again at the study guide. Top of the study guide, we have the psukim. Okay, now there it says at the top, it says al kol zera. If you put water on the seeds, which means on the product, and then the sheretz falls upon it, it will be impure. What will be impure? The food, right? Now, now the tamei lechem refers to what? The nafal midiv latamalav, the sheretz falls on the food, and then lachem is on the food, on the impurity falling upon the food. But it's not going on the beginning part of the pasuk. The lachem and the fact that we have a yad doesn't relate to the very beginning of the pasuk about what has to happen first, which is water has to get on the seed. Now, that has to get on the actual food. Just the part about then when the sheretz falls upon it, okay, then we have the din of yad. Then the lachem comes into play, the drasha. Umar Safar, Makani Drash, the Fanav, the Fnei Panav. And the other one says, what do you mean? The Lachem goes back to, not only to the previous section, but to the one before it. It's like a modifier issue. To what is Lachem modifying? Rabbi Yochanan says, modifying the entire Pasuk. So the whole thing Yab works for. Some say it's a logical argument between them, which is, Mar savar hechsher tchilat tum'ahu. Mar savar hechsher lav tchilat tum'ahu. One says hechsher is the beginning of tuma. So if it works for tuma, obviously it works for hechsher. This idea of the yad. Umar savar, no, hechsher is not tchilat tum'ah. Hechsher is not the beginning of impurity. The beginning of impurity is when the sheretz falls upon it. That's has its own separate laws. Tani kavatet Rabbi Yochanan, this bright to support Rabbi Yochanan. Kishem sheyesh yad l'tumah kach yesh yad lehechsher. Just like there's yad for tumah, there's also yad for hechsher. Exactly like Rabbi Yochanan. Kishem she'em makablim tumah ela chishit talshu. Just like it doesn't become impure unless it's detached from the ground. Kach em makablim hechsher ad talshu. Also, it doesn't become susceptible to impurity until you've detached it from the ground. So the liquid has to get upon it once it's detached. Okay, that was a side point, not related, but the first part proved Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rav, another machloka between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Ein yad lepachot mikazayid ve'ein shomer lepachot mikefol. If you want to talk about a yad working in all the ways we said it works, well, the yad has to be on something that's at least a kazayid. It has to be significant. And in the shomer, it could be smaller, but it has to be at least the size of a fol, which is a bean. Okay, a type of bean that's bigger than the lentils, but it's still much smaller than an olive bulb. For Rabbi Yochanan, the kazayit. For Rabbi Yochanan, Amar yesh yad lepachot mikazayit v'yesh shomer lepachot mikefol. He thinks as long as you have a yad, as long as you have a shomer, it doesn't matter how big the fruit is, okay, or the produce is. Okay, now we're going to have a difficulty from a Tosefta, but okay, shnei atzamot. Okay, we're not going to see how the difficulty works yet, and we're going to show first how it's difficult on Rav, then how it's difficult on Rabbi Yochanan, but all that's going to be in tomorrow's daf. We'll start it right now and just finish to the end of the daf. Shnei atzamot, v'alehem shnei chatzei zeitim. We have two bones. On each bone, we have some meat on the end of it. That is a kazayid. Half a kazayid on each. V'chnis rashehem, shnayim labayit. Both the parts of the bone, not where the meat was, okay, the meat is outside the house, it's a dead body, and the bones, which are attached to the meat, each one to half a zayit, the bones go inside the house, and the house is basically making a tent upon them, habayit tameh. It's as if the meat's in the house, a whole kazayit of it. Even though each bone, only the bone is inside, and on each bone, there's only half a kazayit. On each. Yehuda ben Ekosa Omer Mishum Rabbi Yaakov he'ach shnei atzamot mitzarfim lekazayit. Says, how could this be? How could the two bones combine for a kazayit? Okay, and we're gonna get to this in the next daf and see how this creates a difficulty. So again, just to quickly review, the first part we kind of reviewed, even though I didn't review it enough, but you can look back at the chart and see all the different attempts to figure out how does, again, the main thing, this is what I want you to walk out with, how do we know that a shomer, the pasuk about shomer, for the Asher Yizareh, where we darshan shomer for food, that we're talking about, it's mitzdaref, okay, and not in a yad. Yad is not mitzdaref, but the shomer is. Where do we get that from? And that was basically the distinction made in the Mishna, and then we had to see where we get it from the drashot and the psukim, and then we had to figure out how we understood all the drashot that we saw in the previous daf, and then we went to this difficulty of if it's all because the shomer is because it's planted in the ground. What about things that aren't planted in the ground? What about fruits? What about meat and chicken? Meat and eggs and fish. And then we explained where we get that from, the three mentions. From there, we got to these two debates between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan about, is there also yad for hechsher? And is there yad for less than a certain requisite amount of, if the food doesn't have a certain requisite amount, is there still a law of yad? With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.